Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's session of the Energy Community webinar series. In this presentation, we will go through three main topics and three main blocks. The first will be about the main features and the characteristics of the emission trading schemes in general, and also we'll focus a bit on the EU best practice. Then we will look at two case studies, how the different emission trading schemes can be linked to each other. And then third, I will walk you through the main elements of our proposal for an emission trading scheme in the energy community. This slide might be familiar for many of you. It shows the European Commission's current flagship project, the European Green Deal. You will see that climate actions, and within the climate actions, the upgrade and the extension of the ETS is one of the main elements. The extension here means extending the scope of the sectors which are subject to emission trading to new areas. If you have been following the news, you can see that the discussion now is about how to extend it to transport, maritime and road transport. But at the same time, it is also including several minor refinements to the legal framework. These days, the discussions about the ETS are very popular and very mainstream because of the high level of interest. However, in the energy community, we have realized already several years ago that the reforms in the energy sector and the realization of the internal market has to go hand in hand with some efforts to tackle climate change. The contracting parties have now reached a good level of progress in reforming their energy sectors. However, when it comes to specific parts, such as the power generation, still the share of old lignite and coal-fired power plants is very high, and this puts an excessive burden on the environment. The energy community has the mandate to work on environmental issues and to work on the provision of clean energy, but it has realized that it can no longer function only as an energy community, but it has to go beyond and has to embrace energy and the climate community. On this slide, you see the main elements of proposals for this direction. Already in 2016, the Ministerial Council proposed the adoption of a regulation, which is an element of the ETS legal package. This regulation, called the Mmr Regulation in short, was about the mechanism for monitoring and reporting the greenhouse emissions. The reason for this is that because this is the first step, that you have to be aware what kind of emissions are emitted, by whom and to what extent, if you want to put in place any measures to price these emissions and to reduce these emissions. Further on in 2018, there was a recommendation on the development of national energy and climate plans. This is the work ongoing right now, and the contracting parties are drafting the first version of their plans. These plans are important because they give an overview of the how to. Then in 2018 and 2019, general policy guidelines were put forward for the 2030 targets of the energy community contracting parties. The reason for this is, on one hand, to follow up and to be in line with the EU ambitions, but on the other hand, this is again an essential element for emission trading, since to be able to know to what extent you can allow emissions, you have to know what the targets are to reduce them. An important part of these policy guidelines are the different legal acts which you see listed. And the last one of them, the so-called governance regulation, is indeed a new transformed version of the old Mmr regulation, which you can see on the top of the slide. So in this case, the energy community continues to insist on the adoption of these monitoring and reporting rules. The ETS in itself is just one of the several instruments when it comes to putting a price on carbon emissions. The overall concept of an ETS is that you take the overall emissions and you put a decreasing trend on them, so you limit the overall availability of so-called emission allowances, which entitle to polluters to emit 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent. The downward pressure on the availability of these allowances make it push the market participants to evolve and to put in place more and more efficient solutions. Ultimately, there will be some market players who will have to stop their operations and move out of the market. In an ETS, these emission allowances can be distributed in two ways, either via free allocation or via auctions. In the free allocation, as it says, the participants, the installations receive these allowances, and when the time comes, they can use this to justify, to offset their actual emissions. In the auction, the market participants have to buy these allowances, and the prices of these allowances normally will reflect the balance between supply and demand. Again, I have to emphasize that with the curtailment, with the decreasing number of available allowances, will lead to the increasing price. So it will be more and more costly for the market participants to keep their pollution at the usual levels. Apart from the ETS, you have the carbon tax, fuel tax, different tax types, and also the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which can be considered as a way to reduce the emissions. Now, when it comes to the EU ETS system, and we will go into this now, I have to tell you that this includes only half of all the EU emissions. The other half covers those sectors which are not subject to the ETS, and they are regulated in a different regulation called the Effort Sharing Regulation. The sectors which are subject to the ETS have been gradually widened. At the very beginning, only some large industrial facilities and power plants were included. Later, aviation was added, and other industrial facilities were included as well. The evolution of the ETS goes back to the last 15 years. It has been placed since then, which gives an ample time both for the member states but also the market participants to adapt to this evolving framework and to be able to operate with this allowance trading and allowance distribution system. The phases of the EU ETS can be separated into 4 parts. As I mentioned, this is an ever-evolving legal and policy instrument, so for sure we will see phase 5, phase 6 in the future. The gradual evolution included not just the widening of the scope of the sectors which are subject to the ETS, but also the types of gases which are included. In the beginning, it was only CO2, but later other gases like nitrous oxide or perfluorinated gases were also added. Also, the geographical scope broadened. Starting from the EU 25, additional countries joined, and some of these countries are not member states, such as Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. As the years went by, these changes invoked moving generally from the free allocation, which was done by national countries and national authorities, towards more auctions and towards a more regional, more EU-wide governance. This is important to mention because this is an evolutionary path that we have to take into account when designing the options for the energy community. The current phase of the EU ETS, which will start next year, includes a completely refurbished legal framework. Both the ETS directive and the related regulations have been updated. Also, the annual reduction of allowances has been stepped up from 1.7% to 2.2%. Some new elements and some new tools have been added. The MSR, which you see on the slide, stands for Market Stability Reserve. This is an important tool which started to operate in 2019, and the legislators introduced this in order to tackle one of the main problems, one of the main challenges of the EU ETS, and that is the oversupply of allowances. I'll come back to that in a second when we talk about the prices. In the future, the free allocation will be gradually phased out. Even the fact that it survives until 2020 is the result of long-term negotiations. However, the objective is to put all the emission trading on a business, on a market base, and to carry it out via auctions. There are several possibilities for supporting the extension of the ETS, the operation of the ETS, and to make this economically feasible. The different funds which you can read serve different functions. The first one, the Innovation Fund, is there to use the revenues from the auctioning of allowances and to channel this money into new projects in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, in research and development. The idea here is to use the funds paid by the polluters to put in place new and innovative technologies. The Modernization Fund is another fund which also uses income from the auction revenues of the allowances, and this aims at providing help to those countries, those EU member states, whose economy are weak, whose economy is highly dependent on polluting activities. These are countries located in Central and Eastern Europe. So you see that the income from the auctions is a key point when it comes to providing the different support programs. And in the news recently, when it comes to the post-COVID-19 actions and recovery plan, again, the income from the ETS auctions come up again and again. One of the points of extending the ETS to new sectors is to generate new revenues, which then can be used for the economic recovery after the virus outbreak. In the last 7 years, 8 years, the level of these revenues reached around 27 billion euros. But to how much the revenues are dependent on the prices shows that more than half of these revenues were collected just in 1 year, in 2018. In this slide, it's a key question to what extent the price of the allowances will reflect the actual supply and demand, and to what extent an overflow of allowances, of unused allowances, will flood the market and collapse the price. Where are these allowances traded? There are two major auction platforms. One is the European Energy Exchange, and the other one is the UK-based ICE, Intercontinental Exchange. And here on this slide, you can see an overview of the price evolution starting from July 2018. And you can see the gradual increase as a result of the different policy measures to withdraw the extra allowances from the market. You can nicely see that from around 15 euros, it increased to 25 euros. And then, of course, you can see the spring of 2020, when the price slumped due to the COVID-19. And in spite of the worries that it might stay stuck down there, there are some promising signs of a rebound and, again, increasing trend. On this slide, I will not spend much time. This is what I mentioned about the use of the revenues. You can see how the member states use their auction revenues used in the period between 2013 and 2017. It is partly set in the legislation how these revenues can be used, so they cannot use it just for anything what they want. But this gives a good overview of the weights of the main groups. You can see it's mostly renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors which receive the income from the auctions. Now, after looking at the snapshot of the EU ETS, let's see how one can link to this system. Norway was one of the non-member states who linked to the EU ETS after having fulfilled the basic conditions. These conditions ensure that there is a level playing field between the market participants of the EU member states and that country who wishes to link to the EU ETS. And these conditions are the following. There has to be a mandatory emission trading system in the country with absolute limits on the emissions. There has to be a registry system which duly takes into account the allowances and the emissions. And there has to be a very sophisticated monitoring system which monitors the compliance, and if there is a non-compliance of the market participants, then appropriate penalties are introduced. You can see that the Norwegian system started more or less at the same time as the EU ETS in 2005. At the time, it covered only 10% of the Norwegian emissions, but already from the very beginning, there was a political ambition to link to the EU emission trading scheme. At the first phase of the EU ETS, the Norwegian market participants could already buy EU allowances and use it to cover their own emissions. However, this was only a one-way transfer. The EU market participants could not purchase Norwegian allowances. This changed as a result of negotiations in 2008, when the Norwegian ETS was linked to the EU ETS through a decision of the EEA Joint Committee. This meant that the European legislation was incorporated in the Norwegian legislation. There were some minor changes, but let's say 80–90%, the obligations, the roles, the rights are the same in Norway as in any other member state of the EU. And this also shows that today roughly half of the Norwegian emissions are covered in the ETS. It is worth to note that Norway faced similar challenges at the beginning of its ETS as the EU, namely the oversupply of allowances and the very weak or non-existent price signal. This is something which we will have to take into account when designing a solution for the energy community. The other country I would like to tell you about is Switzerland. Switzerland is a bit different case because Switzerland kept its own emission trading scheme. It did not take the EU legislation, it did not transpose the EU legislation in its own national legal system. However, it made the necessary changes to make it fully compliant. Two elements of these changes were that aviation and power plants were included in the Swiss ETS as well. The way of linking between Switzerland and the EU is done that the allowances, each other's allowances are mutually recognized. So if a market participant purchases a Swiss allowance, they can use it in the EU, and it works vice versa the same way. It is important to note that auctions take place in both places separately, in the EU and in Switzerland. However, there are some major differences here. Auctions in the EU and the products, the allowance products traded in the EU auctions are considered as financial instruments. And as such, all the regulations to financial instruments, like MiFID II, are applicable. In the Swiss system, these trades are not considered, these products are not considered as financial instruments, and thus different rules are applicable to them. Of course, you have seen that the EU ETS is gradually evolving and changing, and this makes it important with the linked systems that these changes are transferred to these countries, so in this case to Switzerland as well. The task to make sure that these changes are transferred is vested on the so-called joint committee. This joint committee is operating on a constant basis, and they monitor the legal changes in the EU and make sure that the necessary amendments are done to the Swiss law. And now let me turn to the energy community where we started from, and let me outline to you the main principles and elements how an ETS in the energy community could work. First of all, where the idea comes from. Why does it make sense to put an ETS in place in the energy community? As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the reasons is the decarbonization. The right of the citizens of the contracting parties for fresh air, for clean air, is the same as the citizens of the EU member states. At the same time, we have to make sure that that initiative and that momentum which we have in the energy sector, that the legal rights and the legal obligations between the member states and contracting parties are the same. We have to make sure that this momentum is the same and translated into climate as well. We have to prevent the increasing gap between the EU and the energy community when it comes to climate change and to decarbonization. We have to keep in mind that the proposed EU carbon adjustment tax is something which could be used also on the border of the EU and the contracting parties. What kind of principles we have to take into account when designing an ETS for the energy community? For starters, we have to look at in what condition the contracting parties are, which are their main sources of energy, what is the profile of their emissions, and what is their socio-economic situation. Because we have to make sure that what we propose, it does not put an undue burden on the population or on the economy. We also have to build on existing initiatives. In Montenegro and in Ukraine, we already see elements of an ETS being put in place and starting to operate. We have to build on these initiatives to have a solution that is acceptable to the contracting parties. We have to be gradual. We have seen in the EU that it took 15 years to move from a national allocation of allowances to a European-wide and moving towards auctioning of the allowances. This is something which we have to make sure that takes place. So also in the energy community, we believe that starting off with national measures, making sure that both the authorities and the market participants are comfortable with the system, and then gradually we move towards more market-based approaches and more regional solutions. And last but not least, we have to be realistic. We have to see what can be done in the proposed timeline. And the timeline you can see on this slide. Now, I would like to stress that this is a proposal. This is an indicative illustration of milestones. It is not a legal proposal. It's not an obligation. This is something to start the discussion with our contracting parties and with the European institutions. Starting from an adoption of the relevant legislation, the first step is, as I mentioned, to establish the national rules, to establish the national institutions, and to establish those national practices which enable market participants to start to report their emissions and which enable the authorities to monitor these emissions and to verify them. Then once they know who emits what, then there can be the mechanism for distributing and for allocating these emissions. At the beginning, probably the share of free allocations will be higher, not to put an excessive economic burden on the market participants, and also to train them what to do with these allowances, how to surrender these allowances at the end of the period. Also, the first signs of pricing will appear. However, this will move on once the actual auctions are started. This is the next step. The auctions will start when the legal obligation is put on some market participants that they have to buy their allowances, they will not be able to get them for free. Once the national auctions start, we hope there will be some price signals in the different contracting parties, and once this starts to move, then we can go to the next phase, which is about opening the borders and enabling cross-border trade among the contracting parties. Ideally, this move to cross-border trade would take place in a manner that there would be a centralized auctions for the energy community on one platform applicable to all the contracting parties. As soon as central auctions take place, hopefully again, if there is no oversupply of allowances and there is a realistic price signal, we could assume that this price signal, these prices will evolve, that will start to evolve in a way that is coupled with the EU ETS price. And once we have this correlation, once we have functioning auctions, then will be the point when we can think of, when we can examine how exactly the linkage between an energy community ETS and the EU ETS can be put in place. This is a more distant objective, but this is an objective which we have put for ourselves and which we will work to achieve. In order to have an ETS in the energy community, you've seen the first step is to put the legal framework in place. These are the main legal acts that we would propose as a first step to adapt and to adopt. This includes the ETS directive. This is the backbone of the whole system. Some contracting parties already have this directive as an obligation to adopt in their association agreements with the EU. Such contracting parties are Ukraine and Moldova. Then we have the relevant acts for monitoring and reporting, also for verification, and the legal act which governs the auctions procedure and rules and responsibilities. When we focus at the directive itself, what we would suggest is to keep to the original EU directive as much as possible, but to remove all those extra provisions which would make the transposition more difficult or more cumbersome. When it comes to the scope and to the gases, it would be practically the same as the EU ETS, with the big separate difference is that the aviation sector at the beginning would be included only as a sector to be participating in the reporting process, but would not be subject to allowances at the beginning. Obviously, this is something which then would be phased out. The allowances themselves would function the same way as in the EU. They would be distributed. There would be a surrender of allowances. This means the actual use of the allowances by the market participants. There would be free allocation, but also auctioning. Auctions, once they are the necessary conditions in place, would be organized in a similar way as in the EU. A big difference to the EU system is that, again, to make the transition a bit easier, to make it for the market participants a bit easier to adapt to the new circumstances, we would suggest that the power plants at the very beginning could be subject to free allowances, which would then be phased out. In the EU, the electricity generation sector is currently fully subject to auctions. And this is the way and this is the path that we would also go. Other provisions such as reporting and publication or penalties would be again the same as in the ETS directive, and we would have the same competent authorities and the central administrator. A small difference from the EU evolution would be the registry. In the EU system, there were national registries at the beginning, but in the energy community, we believe that we could harness some economies of scale and we could rule out some incompatibility problems by putting in place from the very beginning an energy community registry of allowances. The directive would include the links to any updates in the Paris Agreement, but given the fact that the EU directive contains lots of provisions to other international agreements, at this stage we would consider it as something that could be skipped, again, just to make it easier to adopt and to adapt this legislation. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation.